My husband left me for his secretary after 15 years of marriage, throwing away our life together for someone half my age. He said I wasn't ambitious enough, that I embarrassed him at company events. 6 months later, I stood on the steps of the county courthouse, outbidding him for the sprawling lakeside mansion he'd always dreamed of owning. The look on his face when he realized I now held the keys to the future he thought I didn't deserve, that moment made every tear worth it. I'll never forget that rainy Tuesday afternoon. The weather matched my mood, dark clouds hanging low as I pulled into our driveway after a particularly exhausting day at the community center where I volunteered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 15 years of marriage had taught me Josh's moods, his habits, his rhythms. Something was off the moment I stepped through our front door. The living room was too quiet. Usually, Josh would be on the phone with clients, his boisterous laugh echoing through our home as he closed another deal. He was one of the city's top real estate developers, a fact he never let me forget. But today, the silence felt deliberate, heavy with intention. "Josh," I called out, setting my tote bag on the entry table. "Are you home early?" I found him in our bedroom, meticulously folding dress shirts into an open suitcase on our bed. Not just any suitcase, the expensive Italian leather one I'd given him for our 10th anniversary. My stomach tightened as I watched his practiced movements, the careful way he arranged his ties, the methodical packing of cufflinks in their velvet pouch. "What's going on?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. The signs had been there for months. Late nights at the office, mysterious weekend client meetings, the growing emotional distance that had slowly replaced the warmth we once shared. Josh looked up, his expression unreadable. At 45, he was still handsome, silver beginning to thread through his dark hair, laugh lines deepening around his eyes. I'd once loved those lines, had prided myself on being the one who put them there. "Alicia," he said, my name sounding foreign on his tongue. "We need to talk." Those 4 words, the harbinger of endings. I remained in the doorway, unwilling to step fully into what was about to happen. "I think we both know this isn't working anymore," he continued, not meeting my eyes. "It hasn't been for a long time." "What isn't working?" I asked, my voice eerily, calm despite the earthquake beginning inside me. "Our marriage, our life together, the last 15 years? He sighed, that familiar sound of exasperation I'd grown accustomed to. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We've been drifting apart, you must have noticed. Drifting apart, as if it were a natural phenomenon, like continents slowly separating, not a deliberate series of choices he'd been making. Is there someone else?" The question escaped before I could stop it, hanging between us like smoke. The slight flinch, the momentary tightening of his jaw. I had my answer before he spoke. "That's not the point," he said, folding another shirt with precise movements. "It is absolutely the point," I replied, stepping into the room now, anger beginning to replace the initial shock. "At least have the decency to be honest with me. After 15 years, I deserve that much." He stopped packing, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Fine, yes. There's someone else." The confirmation shouldn't have hurt as much as it did. I'd suspected for months, had seen the signs, had felt him pulling away, but hearing him say it aloud made it real in a way my suspicions hadn't. "Who?" I demanded, though again, some part of me already knew. "Courtney," he said, and the name landed like a slap. Courtney, his executive assistant, 27 years old, always immaculately dressed in designer outfits that probably cost more than she made in a month. I'd met her at company parties, had watched her laugh at Josh's jokes, had noticed the way her hand lingered on his arm. "Your secretary," I said flatly. "How original." His expression hardened. "Executive assistant. And it's not like that. She Understands me, Alicia. She supports my ambitions, my vision. We connect on a level that you and I haven't in years. Because she worships the ground you walk on? Because she's young enough to be impressed by your stories? Because she hasn't seen you fail yet? Because she challenges me, he shot back. Because she has her own dreams, her own goals. She's not content just being Josh Walker's wife. She wants more from life. The words cut deeper than he could know. For 15 years, I'd structured my entire existence around being his partner, his support system. I'd abandoned my own career in marketing to move across the country for his first big development opportunity. I'd hosted countless dinner parties for his clients, had played the perfect corporate wife at every function. I'd set aside my own dreams because he had convinced me that his were bigger, more important. She wants more from life, I repeated slowly. And what exactly do you think I've wanted all these years, Josh? To be an accessory to your success? To stand in your shadow while you take credit for a partnership I've poured everything into? That's not fair, he said, but his eyes shifted away. You chose this life. You were happy with the arrangement. Was I? Or was I just telling myself? I was happy because acknowledging the truth would have meant facing how deeply unhappy I'd become. He zipped the suitcase closed with a finality that echoed in my chest. I'm not going to debate this, Alicia. My mind is made up. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce. Your lawyer, I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping me. Of course. Always so efficient. He lifted the suitcase from the bed, finally looking me in the eyes. What surprised me most wasn't the lack of love in his gaze, that had been gone for some time, but the lack of regret. He wasn't just leaving. He was relieved to be going. For what it's worth, he said, pausing at the bedroom door. I did love you once, very much. Once, I echoed. Lucky me. As he moved past me, the familiar scent of his cologne lingered, and with it, a flash of memory. Josh standing in the kitchen of our first apartment, champagne in hand, celebrating the sale of his first property. One day, he'd promised, eyes bright with dreams. We'll own that mansion on Lake Montgomery. The big one with the private dock and the stone facade. And it'll be because we built something amazing together. We, us, together. Words that no longer applied. The house on Lake Montgomery, I said suddenly, stopping him in his tracks. Is that still your dream? The one you've been saving for? A flicker of surprise crossed his face. Why does that matter now? Just answer the question, Josh. Is that still the dream house? The one you talk about to impress people at parties? He studied me for a moment, confusion replacing his earlier certainty. Yes. Actually, it's going up for auction next month. The owners defaulted on their mortgage. I nodded slowly, something cold and determined settling in my chest. Good to know. He hesitated, seemed about to say something more, then thought better of it. Without another word, he continued down the hallway. Moments later, I heard the front door close with a soft click, and just like that, 15 years ended. No dramatic showdown, no plates thrown against walls, no tearful pleas to reconsider. Just the quiet departure of a man who had decided I was no longer worth the investment. I stood frozen in our bedroom, my bedroom now, surrounded by the evidence of his calculated exit. Half-empty closet, vacant dresser drawers, the indentation on his side of the mattress already beginning to fade. Didn't cry. Not then. Something else was taking shape inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. As the silence of the house pressed in around me, I made myself a promise. This wouldn't be the end of my story. It would be the beginning. The day after Josh left, I woke to the jarring sound of my alarm clock, the same mundane beeping that had started every day of my married life. For a moment, I reached across to his side of the bed, my body operating on 15 years of muscle memory. The cold emptiness that met my fingertips jolted me back to reality. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This was my life now. This quiet house. This half-empty bed. This strange, untethered feeling of being suddenly single at 43. I forced myself through the motions of my morning routine, brushing my teeth in a bathroom now freed from Josh's expensive grooming products, making a single cup of coffee instead of two. Small, ordinary tasks that now felt foreign without the rhythms of our shared existence. As I sat at our kitchen island, imported Italian marble that Josh had insisted upon during our last renovation, I scrolled through old photos on my phone. Pictures of us from happier times, our honeymoon in Santorini, weekend getaways to the mountains, charity galas where I'd stood proudly beside him in carefully selected gowns. In every photo, the same pattern emerged. Josh at the center, commanding. Attention. Me slightly to the side, smiling supportively. Always the perfect accessory to his success. Had I always been so peripheral in my own life? Had I always dimmed my light to make his shine brighter? I remembered who I was before Josh, ambitious Alicia Parker, marketing wunderkind who'd helped launch 3 successful startups before her 30th birthday. The woman who'd once been profiled in Business Quarterly as one to watch. The woman with plans, with fire, with dreams of her own. When had I set those dreams aside? When had I become content with being known simply as Josh Walker's wife? The transition had been so gradual, I'd barely noticed it happening. First, the move from Seattle to Boston for his career opportunity, a temporary sacrifice that meant leaving my position as marketing director. Then, the increasing demands of his social calendar, client dinners, networking events, weekend retreats, all requiring my presence as the supportive spouse. It's just for now, he'd assured me when I expressed interest in returning to work. Once I establish the business, you can do whatever you want. But right now, I need you focused on us, on our future. Our future. Always spoken about as if it were a joint venture, though the blueprint seemed designed entirely around his ambitions. And I had accepted it, had convinced myself that my new role as corporate wife was equally important, equally fulfilling. I threw myself into it with the same determination I'd once applied to my career, planning perfect dinner parties, cultivating relationships with the wives of Josh's colleagues, volunteering for charities that enhanced his professional reputation. Became exactly what he needed me to be. Polished, pleasant, purposefully undemanding. The memory of a particular evening surfaced, a dinner party at our home about 6 months ago. Josh had invited Donnie Prescott, the developer behind Lake Montgomery Estates, and his wife Genevieve. The coveted lakeside mansion Josh had always dreamed of was part of that development, and he was determined to impress Donnie enough to get an inside track when one of the properties eventually came available. I'd spent days preparing, selecting the perfect menu, arranging for a private chef, choosing wines that complemented each course without appearing ostentatious. Every detail had been considered, every aspect designed to present us, to present Josh, in the most favorable light. The evening had gone perfectly, conversation flowing as smoothly as the wine, until dessert, when Donnie had unexpectedly turned his attention to me. "Josh tells me you used to work in marketing, Alicia," he said, spooning into the chocolate souffle I'd stressed over for days. "At quite a high level, from what I understand." "Oh," I'd replied, momentarily taken aback by interest in my past career. "Yes, I did, before we moved to Boston." "She was quite good," Josh interjected quickly, his hand finding mine on the table in what appeared to be an affectionate gesture, though I felt the subtle pressure of his fingers, a warning to keep it brief. But we agreed that one high-powered career in the family was enough of a challenge. Laughter rippled around the table, polite and practiced. "What a shame," Genevieve said, her voice carrying a note of genuine regret. The world needs more women in leadership positions. Alicia has plenty of leadership opportunities with her charity work, Josh responded smoothly before I could answer. She's on the board of the Children's Hospital Foundation, aren't you, darling? I nodded, the practiced smile never leaving my face. It's very fulfilling. I'm sure it is, Donnie said, but his eyes held a question as they met mine across the table. Still, talent like yours shouldn't go to waste. If you ever decide to get back in the game, give me a call. We're always looking for sharp minds in our marketing department. Josh's laugh had an edge to it. Trying to poach my wife, Donnie? Isn't it enough that you own half the lakefront property I'm after? The conversation shifted then, back to real estate and development plans, and I was once again relegated to the background, my brief moment in the spotlight efficiently dimmed by my husband's practiced redirection. Later that night, as we prepared for bed, Josh had commented casually, Donnie was just being polite, about the job. I know, I'd replied automatically, though something inside me had stirred at the possibility, the first such opportunity mentioned in years. Besides, Josh continued, your charity work is much more suitable at this stage in our lives. More flexible, and it makes the right impression with my clients. The devoted wife, giving back to the community. I'd nodded, swallowing the strange disappointment rising in my throat. Of course. That's my girl, he'd said, kissing my forehead before turning out the light. Always understanding the bigger picture. The bigger picture. His picture, with me as a minor detail in the composition. Sitting in our silent kitchen the day after he left, that conversation replayed in my mind with new clarity. How had I not seen it then? The casual dismissal of my abilities, the swift recategorizing of my identity to suit his narrative, the underlying assumption that my purpose was to reflect well on him. My phone buzzed with a text message pulling me from my thoughts. It was from Jade, my closest friend, and the one person who had never quite warmed to Josh despite my repeated attempts to facilitate a connection between them. Heard the news, coming over with emergency supplies, no arguments. Despite everything, I smiled. Jade had never been one to wait for an invitation or ask permission. It was one of the things Josh had found problematic about her refusal to conform to his expectations of how a proper corporate wife's friend should behave. An hour later, she swept through my front door with 2 bottles of wine, a bag of groceries, and a determined expression on her face. That absolute bastard, were her first words as she set everything down on the kitchen counter. I've wanted to say that for about 14 years, just so you know. Only 14? I asked, attempting humor despite the hollow feeling in my chest. You gave him a grace period? The first year I was reserving judgment, she replied, uncorking one of the wine bottles with practiced efficiency. By year 2, I knew he was trouble. Too charming, too calculated, too convinced of his own importance. She poured 2 generous glasses, sliding one across the counter to me. To freedom, she said, raising her glass. Even when it comes wrapped in heartbreak and betrayal. I hesitated, then lifted my glass to meet hers. To freedom, I echoed, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. Freedom. Was that what this was? This untethered feeling, this sudden absence of expectations, this yawning uncertainty about who I was supposed to be now that I was no longer Josh Walker's wife. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, Jade said, as if reading my thoughts. But I promise you, Alicia, this is going to turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to you. I shook my head, taking a sip of wine. He left me for his 27-year-old secretary, Jade, after 15 years. How is that possibly the best thing that ever happened to me? Because, she said firmly, now you get to remember who you were before him. Who you were always meant to be before you got sidetracked by his ambitions and his ego and his endless need to be the center of the universe. I stared into my wine glass, watching the light refract through the deep red liquid. I'm not sure I even remember who that person was. Jade's expression softened. Well, I do, and she was magnificent, brilliant, unstoppable. And she's still in there, beneath all the perfect corporate wife conditioning. We just need to wake her up. For the first time since Josh walked out the door, I felt something other than shock and betrayal. A tiny flicker of possibility, a whisper of the woman I used to be, stirring somewhere deep inside. I wouldn't even know where to start, I admitted. Jade smiled, a determined glint in her eye. Lucky for you, I do. Step 1. We figure out exactly what that bastard left you with, and then we start planning your comeback. 3 days after Josh left, I still hadn't told anyone except Jade. I wasn't ready to face the pity, the whispered conversations, the inevitable questions about what had gone wrong. But life in Boston's close-knit real estate development community made privacy a luxury I couldn't afford for long. I was in line at Westfield's, the upscale grocery store where all of Boston's elite did their shopping, when I first realized how public my humiliation would become. I'd forced myself to leave the house, determined to maintain some semblance of normalcy despite feeling like my world had imploded. Alicia, I thought that was you, came a voice from behind me. I turned to see Vanessa Miller, wife of one of Josh's business associates and a fixture in our social circle. Her smile was too bright, her eyes too inquisitive as they darted to my left hand, still bearing my wedding ring. Vanessa, hello? I replied, summoning the polite smile I'd perfected over years of such encounters. How are you? She asked, her tone conveying that she already knew I was far from fine. I'm well, thank you, I said, the social script so ingrained, I could perform it on autopilot. Are you sure? Her voice dropped to a theatrical whisper. I heard about Josh and, well, you know. My stomach tightened. News traveled fast in our circle, but this was lightning speed. I'm sorry? Vanessa's eyes widened with artificial concern. Oh, you don't... She stopped, covering her mouth with manicured fingers. I assumed you knew about Josh and Courtney. I saw them yesterday at La Voile. They seemed quite comfortable together. La Voile. Our favorite restaurant, the place where we'd celebrated our 10th anniversary. I see, I managed, fighting to keep my expression neutral despite the knife twisting in my chest. They're not being very discreet about it, Vanessa continued, seeming to relish her role as bearer of bad news. Everyone's talking. I just assumed you were aware. Everyone's talking. Of course they were. In our social circle, a high-profile separation was prime gossip material, especially one involving a younger woman. Thank you for your concern, I said, my voice steady despite the humiliation burning through me. But Josh and I are handling our private matters privately. Vanessa nodded, not looking remotely convinced. Of course. Well, if you need anything, the insincerity of her offer hung in the air between us. I appreciate that. If you'll excuse me, I said, abandoning my half-filled cart and walking out of the store, dignity intact, but pride shattered. In the safety of my car, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, allowing the tears to come at last, not just for Josh's betrayal, I'd already cried those tears, but for the public spectacle my life had become, the pitying glances, the whispered conversations that would stop when I entered a room, the knowledge that I was now cast as the discarded wife, the cautionary tale, the object of gossip. When I finally composed myself enough to drive, I didn't go home. Instead, I found myself parking outside Donovan Financial Group, Josh's primary investment partner, and the venue for their annual charity gala, scheduled for that very evening. I'd helped plan this event months ago, had selected the caterer, arranged the floral displays, coordinated with the silent auction donors. It was supposed to be another evening of playing the perfect corporate wife, of bolstering Josh's image and connections. Now the thought of attending, of facing all those people who knew, who were talking, who were watching for my reaction, made my stomach churn. But the alternative, hiding away while Josh paraded Courtney around as if our marriage had meant nothing, was worse. Decision made, I drove home and marched directly to my closet. If I was going to face the whispers, I would do it on my terms. The black dress I selected was one Josh had always considered too bold. "A bit desperate for a woman your age," he'd commented the one time I'd worn it. It hugged my curves in a way that made me feel powerful, confident. The woman I used to be would have worn this dress without hesitation. 4 hours later, I stepped into the grand ballroom of Donovan Financial Group alone, head held high despite the nervous flutter in my stomach. The room was already filled with Boston's business elite, the air buzzing with conversation and the clink of champagne glasses. I felt the shift immediately, the subtle turning of heads, the quick glances, the whispered exchanges. I was the evening's unexpected entertainment, the abandoned wife brave enough, or foolish enough, to show her face. Jade materialized at my side within moments, resplendent in emerald green and righteous anger. "You didn't tell me you were coming," she hissed, linking her arm with mine in a show of solidarity. "I would have picked you up." "Last-minute decision," I replied, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server. "Seemed better than sitting home alone, imagining it." "Well, you look incredible," she said firmly, like a woman about to burn down her ex's life. I managed a small smile. Not burning, just refusing to disappear. "Even better," Jade nodded, approvingly. "Oh, heads up, 3 o'clock. The human embodiment of midlife crisis and his child bride have arrived." I turned, following her gaze to the entrance where Josh was indeed making his entrance with Courtney on his arm. She was wearing a red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. A dress that I realized with a fresh stab of humiliation he had likely purchased for her with our joint funds. But it wasn't their appearance that caught me off guard. I'd prepared myself for that inevitable moment. It was their reception. Rather than the awkward silence or subtle distancing I'd expected from our social circle, they were being welcomed warmly. Handshakes for Josh, air kisses for Courtney, business as usual. "People have short memories when there's money involved," Jade muttered, correctly interpreting my expression. "Especially these people." I watched as Matteo Donovan, our host and one of Boston's most influential financiers, greeted Josh with a collegial backslap before turning an appreciative eye to Courtney. The message was clear. In this world, I was replaceable, disposable, just an accessory that had been upgraded for a newer model, Alicia. Nick Reynolds, Josh's longtime business partner, approached with careful courtesy. "It's good to see you here tonight." "Is it?" I asked, my voice sharper than intended. I rather thought I'd be persona non grata at these events going forward. Nick had the grace to look uncomfortable. "You've always been valued in your own right. You know that." "Have I?" I glanced meaningfully across the room where Josh was now introducing Courtney to a group of investors. Funny how quickly 15 years of relationships can be reassigned. "It's not like that," Nick protested weakly. "It's exactly like that," I countered. "But don't worry, I'm not here to make a scene. Just to remind everyone that I haven't evaporated simply because Josh decided I was inconvenient to his narrative." Before Nick could respond, the room's attention was drawn to the small stage where Matteo Donovan was tapping a microphone. "Welcome, everyone, to our annual charity gala," he began, his voice filling the ballroom. "Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to recognize some of the key people who made this event possible." I sipped my champagne, expecting to be overlooked. Despite my months of work on the event, it wouldn't be the first time my contributions had been attributed to Josh or simply ignored. "First, our major donors and sponsors," Matteo continued, listing off names of companies and individuals. Josh's name received enthusiastic applause. And special thanks to Josh Walker and his team for their work on the auction items. Josh has always had an eye for value, as evidenced by his recent personal acquisitions. A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the crowd. Beside me, Jade inhaled sharply. Did he just make a joke about Josh trading me in? Yes, he did, I said quietly, my cheeks burning with humiliation. Across the room, I saw Josh grin, his arm tightening around Courtney's waist as she giggled. In that moment, something inside me hardened. This wasn't just about Josh leaving me. This was about an entire system that treated women as disposable, that rewarded men for discarding their aging wives, that turned a decade and a half of my life into a punchline. I need some air, I murmured to Jade, setting down my glass and moving toward the terrace doors. Outside, the cool night air was a balm against my flushed skin. I gripped the stone balustrade, breathing deeply, fighting back tears that were as much anger as hurt. Mrs. Walker? A deep voice interrupted my thoughts. Or is it Ms. Parker now? I'm not sure of the protocol. I turned to find Donnie Prescott, the Lake Montgomery developer, watching me with a concerned expression. Neither am I admitted, straightening my shoulders. But Alicia is fine. He nodded, moving to stand beside me at the railing. That was a cheap shot in there, uncalled for. I appreciated that he didn't pretend not to know what had upset me. Apparently, I'm the punchline of the season. Not to everyone, he said firmly. Some of us remember who did the actual work all these years while Josh took the credit. I glanced at him, surprised. What do you mean? Donnie laughed softly. You think we didn't notice? The connections you cultivated, the relationships you maintained, the subtle course corrections whenever Josh was about to put his foot in his mouth. You were the secret weapon, Alicia, the emotional intelligence behind his success. His words washed over me like a revelation. All these years, I'd assumed my contributions went unnoticed, unvalued by anyone except Josh, and even his. Appreciation had been conditional, utilitarian. He never saw it that way, I said quietly. His loss, Donnie replied simply. By the way, I meant what I said at dinner that night, about there being a place for you in our marketing department. The offer still stands. I started to automatically decline, the reflex of a woman trained to minimize her own ambitions, but stopped myself. Why shouldn't I consider it? What was holding me back now? I might be interested in discussing that, I said slowly. Donnie smiled, reaching into his jacket pocket and producing a business card. Call my office Monday. We'll set something up. As he walked away, I turned the card over in my fingers, feeling the weight of possibility it represented. For the first time since Josh left, I felt something other than humiliation and grief. I felt the stirring of purpose, the first inklings of a plan. Donnie Prescott's business card sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days. I'd walk past it, pick it up, set it down again, my mind a battlefield of competing voices. You're not ready. You've been out of the industry too long. Who do you think you are? What if you fail? The loudest voice, the one that sounded suspiciously, like Josh, kept repeating, You're 43. Starting over is for younger women like Courtney. I sat at the counter on the 4th morning, coffee growing cold between my palms, staring at that embossed rectangle of possibility. My phone buzzed with an incoming call, Josh's lawyer, the 3rd call this week. I let it go to voicemail, already, knowing the message, papers ready to sign, settlement terms to discuss, the business-like dismantling of 15 years. Outside, rain streaked the windows in rivulets that matched my internal state, blurry, directionless, caught between earth and sky. The house felt too big now, too empty without the force of Josh's personality filling every corner. Or maybe it was that I'd made myself too small, compressing my own needs and desires until they barely registered. The doorbell rang, startling me from my thoughts. Jade stood on the porch, raincoat glistening with droplets, determination written across her face. "Intervention time," she announced, brushing past me into the foyer. "You're not answering my texts, you haven't been returning calls, and from the looks of it," she gestured to my pajamas, worn for the second day straight, "you're in full retreat mode." "I'm processing," I corrected her, following her into the kitchen where she immediately began brewing fresh coffee. "Processing is healthy. Hiding is not." She spotted Donnie's card on the counter and picked it up. "You haven't called him." It wasn't a question. "I'm not ready." "Bull," Jade said flatly, turning to face me. "You're scared. There's a difference." "Maybe I have reason to be," I retorted, irritation flaring. "I've been out of the workforce for over a decade. My contacts are outdated. My skills are rusty, at best. And all of my recent experience consists of planning parties and chairing charity committees." "So?" "That's all project management and relationship building. Valuable skills in any context." She handed me a fresh mug of coffee. "The real issue isn't your qualifications, Alicia. It's that you've spent so long being defined as Josh's wife that you don't know who you are without that label." Her words hit with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, cutting straight to the heart of my hesitation. For 15 years, every decision I'd made, every relationship I'd cultivated, every aspect of my public persona had been in service to Josh's career and our shared social standing. Who was I without that framework? What remained of Alicia Parker beneath years of carefully constructed Mrs. Walker? "I saw them yesterday," I said quietly, changing the subject. "Josh and Courtney. They were looking at apartments in the Seaport District." Jade's expression softened. And they looked happy." I swallowed against the unexpected tightness in my throat. "Like we used to be, in the beginning. Before everything became about his career, his ambition, his image." "You mean before he systematically dismantled your confidence and independence?" Jade's bluntness was both painful and necessary. "Before he convinced you that his dreams were the only ones that mattered?" "It wasn't like that," I protested weakly. "Not at first. He was supportive of my career initially. He used to brag about how brilliant I was." "Until your brilliance threatened to outshine him," Jade countered. "Then, suddenly it made more sense for you to focus on being the corporate wife." She wasn't wrong. I remembered the subtle shift, the way Josh's pride in my accomplishments had gradually transformed into something else. Gentle suggestions that my work hours were putting strain on our relationship. Casual comments about how certain business associates' wives managed their homes personally rather than relying on staff. Pointed observations about the importance of being available for networking events. Little by little, my world had contracted, rearranging itself around Josh's priorities until I could no longer distinguish where his ambitions ended and mine began. "I don't even know if I want to go back to marketing," I admitted. "Maybe that's not who I am anymore." "Then figure out who you are now," Jade said simply. "But do it actively, not hiding in this mausoleum to your marriage." She gestured around the kitchen, all sleek surfaces and designer appliances, selected to impress rather than comfort. This house, these things, they were chosen to reflect Josh's taste, Josh's success, Josh's image. None of it is really you, Alicia. I glanced around, seeing our home through new eyes. The austere modern furniture I'd never found comfortable. The minimalist color palette I'd secretly found depressing. The absence of anything truly personal, no family photos, no mementos, nothing that couldn't fit into Josh's carefully curated aesthetic. "You're right," I said slowly. "None of this is me. I'm not even sure I know what me looks like anymore." "Then that's where we start," Jade declared, pulling out a chair and sitting across from me, her expression serious. "Before you decide about Donnie's job offer or anything else, you need to reconnect with yourself. The real Alicia, not Josh Walker's carefully constructed wife." And how exactly do I do that? I asked, a hint of desperation creeping into my voice. By remembering who you were before him. The woman with opinions and passions and plans that had nothing to do with being someone's perfect accessory. Jade reached across the counter and took my hand. She's still in there, Alicia. You just need to give her permission to exist again. That afternoon, after Jade left, I found myself standing in our shared home office, or rather, what had once been my office before it gradually transformed into Josh's space. I ran my fingers over the sleek desk where I'd once drafted marketing campaigns, the bookshelves that had once held my professional references now filled with Josh's business books and industry awards. In the back of the closet, I found a box, labeled Alicia Pre-Boston. Inside were relics of my former life, framed certificates of achievement, portfolio samples from campaigns I'd led, a copy of Business Quarterly with my interview. I lifted out the magazine, its pages slightly yellowed. With age, my younger self stared back at me, confident and ambitious, unaware that within a year she would walk away from everything she'd built. Marketing is about telling compelling stories, I'd been quoted as saying, about understanding what people truly want, even when they don't consciously know it themselves. I'd been good at it. At reading people, at crafting narratives that resonated, at building strategies that transformed perception into reality. Those skills hadn't disappeared. They'd simply been redirected toward enhancing Josh's image rather than building my own. What would happen if I reclaimed that expertise for myself? If I stopped using my emotional intelligence to smooth Josh's path and started applying it to my own journey? The thought was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. I spent the rest of the day excavating pieces of my former self from storage bins and forgotten drawers. Old journals, photography from a hobby I'd abandoned when Josh commented that it took too much time away from our social obligations. A half-finished business plan for a boutique marketing agency specializing in female-founded startups. A dream I'd set aside when we moved to Boston. Each recovered artifact felt like reconnecting with a long-lost friend. By evening, these pieces of my past were spread across the living room floor, a physical map of the woman I'd once been, the woman I might become again. My phone rang, Josh's number, not his lawyer's this time. I stared at the screen, heart pounding with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. Hello? I answered, my voice steadier than I expected. Alicia. Josh's familiar voice, the one that had narrated my life for 15 years. We need to talk about the settlement. No greeting. No inquiry about my well-being. Just business as if our marriage had been nothing more than a merger now requiring dissolution. I'm busy right now, I replied, surprising myself with the ease of the refusal. Your lawyer has been calling. I'll deal with him directly. This would be simpler if we could discuss it ourselves, Josh pressed. There's no need to make this contentious. I'm not being contentious. I'm being direct. I ran my fingers over the cover of my old business plan. Unless you have something personal to discuss, I prefer to handle this through proper channels. Pause then. Are you okay? You sound different. I almost laughed. Different. Yes, I supposed I did. I'm fine, Josh. Better than fine, actually. I'm remembering something important. What's that? He sounded genuinely curious, perhaps even concerned. Who I was before I became Mrs. Walker. I said it simply, without accusation or bitterness. Just a statement of fact. Another pause, longer this time. I never asked you to stop being yourself, Alicia. This time I did laugh, a soft exhalation of disbelief. No, you just created a life where there wasn't room for both your ambitions and mine. You never had to ask explicitly. You just designed a reality where the only way I could fit was by making myself smaller. That's not fair, he protested, echoing his words from the day he left. Maybe not, I conceded. But it's true, and the remarkable thing is, I let you do it. I participated in my own diminishment. But that's over now. What does that mean? A new note in his voice. Wariness, perhaps even a touch of alarm. It means I'll have my lawyer contact yours about the settlement, I replied calmly. Goodbye, Josh. I ended the call before he could respond, my hand shaking slightly, but my mind clearer than it had been in days. Perhaps years. The business card still sat on the kitchen counter, a decision waiting to be made. I picked it up, running my thumb over the embossed lettering of Donnie Prescott's name, feeling the weight of opportunity it represented. Before I could second-guess myself, I reached for my phone and dialed the number. Donnie Prescott's office, a professional voice answered. This is Alicia Walker, I said, then caught myself. Actually, it's Alicia Parker. I'd like to schedule a meeting with Mr. Prescott about the position we discussed. As I set up the appointment, for the following morning, I felt something shift inside me. The first tentative steps of a woman reclaiming her power, her identity, her future. The rain had stopped outside. Through the window, I could see breaks in the clouds, patches of blue emerging after the storm. It felt, in that moment, like the perfect metaphor for my own internal weather. Clearing, brightening, making way for whatever came next. I arrived at Prescott Development Group 15 minutes early, dressed in a tailored navy suit I'd unearthed from the back of my closet. The outfit had been a staple of my professional wardrobe in my previous life, before cocktail dresses and charity gala. Attire became my uniform. The receptionist smiled warmly. Ms. Parker? Mr. Prescott is expecting you. Ms. Parker. Not Mrs. Walker. The sound of my maiden name felt like slipping into an old, comfortable pair of shoes. Once familiar, now slightly strange, but increasingly right with each step. Donnie's office reflected his reputation for understated elegance. Comfortable but not ostentatious, impressive without trying too hard. The man himself rose from behind his desk as I entered, his handshake firm and welcoming. Alicia, thank you for coming in. He gestured to a seating area by the window with a view of the harbor. Coffee? Please. I nodded, settling into an armchair. My nerves had subsided on the drive over, replaced by a strange calm. The kind that comes when you've already lost what you thought was most important and realize you're still standing. I was pleased to get your call, Donnie said, handing me a cup. Though I'll admit, I wasn't sure you'd take me up on the offer. Neither was I admitted. It's been a long time since I've thought of myself in professional terms. And yet your reputation in marketing was substantial. He leaned back, studying me. People still talk about the Infinity Tech campaign you spearheaded, transformed an unknown startup into a market leader in less than a year. I blinked, surprised he knew about that. That was almost 15 years ago. Good strategy doesn't expire, Alicia. He smiled. And neither does talent. The question is whether you still want to use yours. The directness of his question was refreshing after years of Josh's careful manipulations. The way he'd wrap criticisms in compliments, suggestions in seeming concern for my well-being. I do, I said firmly. Though I'm rusty, admittedly. Skills can be refreshed, contacts can be rebuilt. Donnie set down his coffee. What I'm interested in is your perspective, the way you see opportunities others miss. For the next hour, we discussed the position, marketing director for Prescott's newest venture, a luxury residential development that needed positioning in an increasingly competitive market. By the time Donnie walked me to the elevator, I had a formal offer and a start date for the following Monday. Welcome aboard, Alicia, he said, shaking my hand again. I look forward to seeing what you bring to the table. As the elevator doors closed, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished metal, cheeks flushed with excitement, eyes bright with purpose. I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. She looked alive. The contrast became even starker that evening when I arrived home to find Josh's Audi in the driveway. My stomach clenched instinctively, my body responding to the familiar sight before my mind could catch up. He was sitting in the kitchen, looking slightly out of place despite having lived there for years. The sight of him, the familiar slope, of his shoulders, the way his hair fell across his forehead, sent a complicated wave of emotions through me. Anger, loss, a traitorous flicker of longing for the man I'd once believed him to be. "You changed the entry code," he said by way of greeting. I had to wait for the neighbor to let me in. "I didn't realize you'd be coming by." I set my purse on the counter, maintaining distance between us. "You should have called." "I did. You didn't answer." He studied me, taking in the suit, the slight makeup, the professional demeanor I'd abandoned years ago at his subtle urging. "You look different." "I had a job interview," I replied, watching his expression shift from surprise to something harder to read. "I start Monday." "A job?" He leaned back, brow furrowing. "With whom?" "Prescott Development Group." A flash of irritation crossed his face. "Donnie Prescott? Seriously, Alicia? Is there a problem with that?" I kept my voice level, though my pulse had quickened. "He's a direct competitor to half my clients," Josh replied, as if this should be obvious. "It puts me in an awkward position." "Your position is no longer my primary concern," I reminded him gently. "We're getting divorced, remember?" He had the grace to look momentarily abashed, but pressed on. "Even so, there are certain professional courtesies, loyalties built over years." "Your loyalties, Josh, not mine." I moved to the refrigerator, pulling out a bottle of water more to create physical activity than from actual thirst. "Besides, you didn't seem concerned about professional courtesy when you began sleeping with your assistant." He flinched. "That's different." "Is it? You made choices prioritizing your happiness without considering how they affected me. I'm doing the same." Josh ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache despite everything. "I didn't come here to argue." "Why did you come?" I asked, genuinely curious. "To collect some things. And to give you this." He slid a folder across the counter toward me. "The settlement proposal from my lawyer." I left the folder where it sat. "I told you, I'll have my lawyer review any proposals." "You haven't even hired a lawyer yet," he pointed out, frustration edging into his voice. "You're dragging this out unnecessarily." "Because I'm not adhering to your timeline?" I raised an eyebrow. "I've been a bit preoccupied with rebuilding the life you demolished, Josh." "I didn't demolish anything," he protested. "Marriages end. People move on. It happens every day." "Yes, they do. But most people don't discard 15 years like yesterday's newspaper." He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose in the way he did when he felt misunderstood. A gesture I'd once found endearing, but now recognized as a tactic, a subtle shifting of blame. "This is exactly why I wanted to handle this directly." "You're making it emotional." "It is emotional," I countered. "Or it should be. For 15 years, I shaped my entire existence around supporting your dreams, your goals, your image. I gave up my career, my independence, my sense of self. And you want me to process all of that on your convenient timeline?" Something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or simply impatience. "I never asked you to give up those things." "Didn't you?" I shook my head. "Maybe not explicitly, but you created conditions where I couldn't maintain them and still be what you needed, what you wanted." "That's not fair," he said, repeating his favorite defense. "I've been thinking a lot about fairness lately," I replied. "About how I let you define what was fair, what was reasonable, what was best for us." "I'm done with that now, Josh. I'll review the settlement when I'm ready, with my lawyer present." He stood, frustration evident in the tight line of his shoulders. "Fine. Take your time. But don't use this divorce to punish me for moving on." The accusation stung, more for its inaccuracy than anything else. "This isn't about punishment. It's about finally prioritizing myself after years of putting you first. As I said the words, I realized their truth. This wasn't about getting back at Josh or trying to hurt him the way he'd hurt me. It was about reclaiming my power, my agency, my right to make decisions based on my own needs rather than his convenience. He moved toward the hallway, pausing at the threshold. "I'll get my things and go." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak further. The sounds of him moving through the house, opening drawers, collecting items from the bathroom, created a strange dissonance. This man who had occupied the center of my universe for 15 years was now just a visitor, gathering the remnants of his presence before disappearing again. When he returned, arms full of clothing and toiletries, his expression had softened slightly. "For what it's worth, I think it's good you're going back to work. You were always talented." The compliment, likely meant as a peace offering, landed like a backhanded slap. Always talented, yet he'd systematically undermined that talent, redirected it toward supporting his ambitions rather than nurturing my own. "I know," I said simply. "I just forgot for a while." He hesitated, seeming on the verge of saying something more, then thought better of it. With a nod, he walked past me toward the door. "Josh," I called after him, a sudden thought occurring to me. "The Lake Montgomery property, the one going up for auction. Are you still interested in it?" He turned, surprise evident in his expression. "Of course. Why?" I shrugged. "Just curious about where you and Courtney plan to settle." A shadow crossed his face at the mention of her name. We haven't discussed." He stopped, regrouping. "My professional interests and personal arrangements are separate matters." "Of course," I echoed, offering a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Just curious." After he left, I sat at the kitchen counter, the settlement folder still untouched beside me. For the first time, I allowed myself to really examine the deterioration of our relationship. Not just the final betrayal of his affair, but the years of small erosions that had preceded it. The way his criticisms had grown more frequent, more pointed as I aged. The increasingly public displays of impatience when I expressed opinions that differed from his. The gradual decline in physical affection, in genuine interest in my thoughts, in the basic courtesy that should exist between partners. It hadn't happened overnight. Like water wearing away stone, it had been a gradual process, so subtle I'd barely noticed until the damage was irreparable. What struck me most powerfully was my own complicity in this erosion. I had accepted his diminishments, had adjusted my behavior to avoid his displeasure, had slowly surrendered pieces of myself to maintain the peace. I had participated in my own disappearance, but no more. The woman who had sat across from Donnie, Prescott today, who had stood her ground with Josh tonight, she was somebody new. Or rather, somebody rediscovered, like a painting that had been hidden beneath layers of varnish, now being carefully, deliberately restored. I opened the settlement folder at last, scanning the terms Josh was proposing. As I suspected, they heavily favored him. Minimal alimony, a quick sale of our shared properties with the proceeds primarily directed toward his investment funds. A clean break that would leave him unburdened and me struggling to rebuild. I closed the folder with a quiet determination. This too would need to change. But for now, I had a weekend to prepare for my first day at Prescott Development Group, my first step toward the life I was reclaiming, one decision at a time. My first 2 weeks at Prescott Development passed in a blur of activity. I'd forgotten the particular rhythm of professional life, the structured days, the focused conversations, the satisfaction of applying expertise to concrete problems. My marketing skills, though rusty, returned more quickly than I'd expected, like muscle memory awakening after a long dormancy. Donnie had assembled a talented team, and I found myself energized by their ideas, their enthusiasm, their respect for my experience despite my years away from the industry. By Friday of my second week, I'd presented a comprehensive marketing strategy for the new development that had earned approving nods from around the conference table. "Excellent work, Donnie," said after the meeting, walking me back to my new office. "You've exceeded expectations already." The simple praise, offered without qualification or hidden agenda, felt like water after a drought. For years, Josh's compliments had always contained subtle redirections. "You're so good at handling people, that's why you're better suited to the social side of our life." Or, "Your attention to detail is impressive. That's why I need you focusing on our home rather than diluting your energy elsewhere." That evening, I worked late, losing myself in the details of the campaign launch. The office had emptied hours ago, the cleaning staff making their rounds as I finalized the presentation for Monday's client meeting. When my phone buzzed with a text message, I expected it to be Jade checking in. Instead, Josh's name appeared on the screen. "We need to talk. Can I come by the house tonight?" I hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. In the 3 weeks since our last encounter, I'd hired a lawyer, formally rejected his settlement proposal, and begun negotiating terms that actually reflected my contributions to our marriage. His lawyer had been increasingly frustrated by my refusal to simply accept what was offered and disappear quietly. "What about?" I replied finally. "Us. I've been doing some thinking. Please?" The unexpected plea caught me off guard. In 15 years of marriage, I could count on one hand the number of times Josh had said "please" in that context, an actual request rather than a disguised demand. "I'll be home in an hour," I texted back, a strange uneasiness settling in my stomach. The drive home gave me time to process my reaction. Why, after everything, did those two simple words, "some thinking," trigger such an immediate response? Why did a part of me still leap toward the possibility of reconciliation, despite all evidence that our relationship had been fundamentally unbalanced? I found Josh waiting on the front steps, a bottle of wine in hand. Not just any wine, but the specific Bordeaux we'd discovered on our honeymoon in France. The symbolic gesture wasn't subtle. "You changed your hair," he said as I approached, his eyes taking in the shoulder-length cut that had replaced my formerly long style, another recent change, part of my ongoing reclamation project. "I did," I acknowledged, unlocking the door without further comment. "Come in." He followed me inside, his presence still disconcertingly familiar in the space we'd shared for years. In the kitchen, he opened the wine while I retrieved glasses, the domestic choreography still ingrained despite our separation. "You're looking well," he offered, sliding a glass toward me. "The job agrees with you." "It does," I confirmed, taking a small sip. "Why are you here, Josh?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I once would have found endearing. "Direct as always. That's one of the things I've always admired about you." I waited, not filling the silence as I once would have done. "I've been thinking about us," he finally continued. "About what happened. About what went wrong." "And?" I prompted when he paused again. "And I think I made a mistake." He met my eyes, his expression contrite. "Leaving the way I did, ending things so abruptly." I set my glass down carefully. "You're saying you regret leaving me for Courtney?" A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. "I'm saying I regret how things ended between us. 15 years deserved. Better than that." The careful phrasing wasn't lost on me. He regretted the method, not the decision itself. "I appreciate the acknowledgement," I said neutrally. "That's it?" A note of frustration entered his voice. "I'm trying to have a real conversation. Here, Alicia." "About what exactly?" "You've expressed regret for how you left. Not that you left." I studied him, really looking at the man I'd devoted so many years to. "What do you want from this conversation, Josh? Absolution? Friendship? A more agreeable approach to the divorce? Settlement?" He sighed, leaning against the counter. "Maybe all of those things. Is that so wrong? We were important to each other for a long time. I'd like to think we still could be, in some way. Where's Courtney tonight? I asked, changing tack. A shadow crossed his face. That's complicated. Understanding dawned. Ah, things aren't working out as perfectly as you imagined? It's not that simple, he said defensively. Relationships are complex. You know that. I do, I agreed. Which is why I'm surprised you seem to think you can walk back into my life with a bottle of wine and vague expressions of regret, and somehow that erases the past few months. I'm not trying to erase anything, he protested. I'm trying to repair some of the damage, to find a way forward that honors what we meant to each other. I considered his words, turning them over like stones in my hand, examining them from different angles. 6 weeks ago, this overture might have broken me, might have kindled desperate hope. Now I could see it clearly for what it was. The problem is, I said finally, you're still approaching this from the perspective of what you want. What would make things easier for you? What would alleviate your guilt or discomfort? That's not fair, he began, falling back on his standard defense. Let me finish, I interrupted, surprising us both with my firmness. You're not here because you've had some profound realization about how you treated me, or because you genuinely want to make amends. You're here because something in your new perfect life isn't working out as planned, and you've decided that maybe the old arrangement wasn't so bad after all. His flinch told me I'd hit the mark. It's more complicated than that, is it? Because, from where I'm standing, it looks remarkably simple. Things with Courtney have hit a rough patch, and suddenly you remember I exist. He took a long swallow of wine, his expression shifting toward the carefully managed charm that had once seemed so genuine to me. Maybe I just miss you. Is that so hard to believe? What do you miss, exactly? I asked, genuinely curious now. My support? My willingness to arrange my life around your convenience? The comfort of knowing someone was always there, handling the details you didn't want to bother with? That's unnecessarily harsh, he said, a hint of the familiar cold edge entering his voice. We had a good marriage for many years. Did we? Or did you have a good arrangement, and I convinced myself it was what I wanted too? He set his glass down with more force than necessary. I see Donnie Prescott has been filling your head with revisionist history. This has nothing to do with Donnie, I said evenly. This is about me finally seeing our marriage clearly, without the filter of trying to make it work at any cost. Josh studied me, something like genuine regret flickering in his eyes. You really have changed. Yes, I agreed simply. I have. We regarded each other across the kitchen island, 15 years of shared history stretching between us like a bridge that had begun to crumble, too damaged for either of us to cross safely. I should go, he said finally, leaving his half-finished wine on the counter. I nodded, walking him to the door in silence. At the threshold, he turned, hesitation in his expression. For what it's worth, he said quietly. I did love you, Alicia. In my way. I know, I replied, understanding the truth of it even as I recognized the inadequacy. In your way. But it turns out that wasn't enough for either of us. After he left, I returned to the kitchen and poured the remaining wine down the sink, watching the deep red liquid disappear. His attempt at reconciliation, if that's even what it had been, had left me feeling strangely empty, not from heartbreak, but from the realization that the man I'd devoted my life to had never really seen me at all. Not as I was, not as I could be. Only as I functioned in relation to him. For the first time since he'd walked out, I felt something close to gratitude for the ending of our marriage. Not because it hadn't hurt. It had, deeply. But because that ending had forced me to begin. Again, to rediscover the woman who existed beyond Josh Walker's wife. I stood in the gutted master bathroom of my home, watching as contractors removed the last of the Italian marble that Josh had insisted upon during our renovation. 3 years ago, the sleek minimalist fixtures he'd selected were already gone, awaiting replacement with the warmer, more classic elements I'd chosen myself. "Ms. Parker," the contractor called, "we found something behind this wall section. Looks like the original. Built-in cabinet was just covered over, rather than removed." I stepped carefully across the drop cloths to examine the discovery, a charming arched niche with delicate woodwork, exactly the kind of architectural detail Josh had dismissed as fussy and dated. "Can you restore it?" I asked, running my fingers over the dusty wood. "Absolutely. It'll be gorgeous once we refinish it." I smiled, oddly moved by this small revelation. Something beautiful had been hiding beneath the surface all along, just waiting to be uncovered. Like me. The renovation had begun as a practical necessity. A pipe leak had damaged part of the bathroom, but had rapidly evolved into something more symbolic. Each selection I made without Josh's input, each change to the spaces he had dominated, felt like reclaiming territory in both my home and myself. My phone buzzed with a text from Jade. "Celebratory dinner tonight?" "Big news to share," I confirmed, and returned to supervising the demolition. A strange contentment settling over me despite the chaos. For the first time in years, I was making choices based solely on what I wanted, what I liked, what felt authentic to me, rather than what would project the right image or please someone else. That evening, I met Jade at Maison Marcel, a cozy French bistro downtown that Josh had always deemed not worth the reservation hassle, despite my fondness for their bouillabaisse. "You're glowing," Jade declared as I slid into the booth across from her. "The job must be going well." "It is," I confirmed, accepting the glass of wine she'd already ordered for me. "But it's more than that. I'm remembering what it feels like to trust my own judgment, to make decisions without second-guessing how they'll be received. Like renovating the bathroom that Josh insisted was perfect?" Jade's smile was knowing. "Exactly. Though, in fairness, a pipe burst made that necessary." I took a sip of the rich burgundy. "But I could have simply replaced what was damaged. Instead, I'm changing everything. And it feels liberating?" Jade suggested. "Exactly." I set down my glass. "But enough about my renovation therapy. You said you had news?" Jade's expression turned serious. "I do. And it's relevant to your situation, actually." She pulled out her tablet, opening a document. "Remember my client, the developer who's been trying to acquire certain waterfront properties?" Jade's legal practice primarily focused on real estate transactions, which had made her an invaluable resource during my divorce proceedings. "Vaguely," I said. "Why?" "Because one of those properties is the Lake Montgomery mansion, the one that's going to auction next month. The one Josh has been obsessed with for years." My interest sharpened immediately. "What about it?" "The auction details have been finalized." She slid the tablet across to me, displaying the formal notice. "Minimum bid is set much lower than expected because of the foreclosure circumstances. There's going to be a feeding frenzy." I scanned the document, a plan beginning to form in my mind. "Is Josh aware of this?" "Oh, yes," Jade confirmed with a sly smile. "My client had a meeting with his investment group yesterday. Josh is apparently pulling together a consortium to make a bid. He's been telling everyone it's a sure thing." I handed the tablet back, my pulse quickening with something that felt like possibility. "Tell me more about this property." For the next hour, as we worked our way through dinner, Jade shared everything she knew about the Lake Montgomery mansion, its troubled history, the multiple owners who had over-leveraged themselves trying to maintain it, the structural issues that had been addressed during the last renovation, but left the previous owners financially overextended. "It's actually a solid investment now," she concluded, despite its checkered past. "The foundation problems are fixed, The location is unbeatable, and waterfront property in that area only appreciates. I pushed my empty plate aside, an idea taking shape, one that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. How does one go about participating in this kind of auction? Jade's eyebrows rose. Alicia Parker, are you thinking what I think you're thinking? Maybe, I admitted, a smile tugging at my lips. It would be quite something, wouldn't it? To own the house Josh has coveted for so long? It would be legendary, Jade agreed, leaning forward. But can you afford it? Even with the lower reserve price, we're talking serious money. It was a fair question. The divorce proceedings were still ongoing, our assets not yet fully disentangled. But there was one resource Josh didn't know about, had never bothered to inquire about, that might make this possible. My grandmother left me a trust, I said slowly. It's been managed by her financial advisor all these years, growing quietly in the background. I've never touched it. Josh doesn't know about it? I shook my head. He knew I inherited something, but he was dismissive, called it pocket change compared to what he was building, so I never corrected his assumption. The truth is, my grandmother was quite shrewd with her investments. The trust is substantial. Jade's eyes widened. How substantial are we talking? I named a figure that made her whistle softly. And all this time, she began. All this time, I had the means to be independent, I finished for her. I just didn't believe I should be. The realization sat between us, both sobering and empowering. For 15 years, I'd allowed Josh to define our financial narrative, his success, his provisions, his generosity enabling our lifestyle. The truth was more complex, as truths usually are. So, Jade said after a moment, are we really doing this? Are you going to bid on Josh's dream house? I took a careful sip of wine, weighing the question. Was this about revenge? About proving something to Josh? Or was it about proving something to myself? I'm not sure yet, I answered honestly. But I want to understand the process, to know what would be involved, whether it's even possible. Jade nodded. I'll connect you with Howard, at my firm. He handles high-end real estate transactions and knows the auction process inside and out. Later that night, I sat on my bedroom floor surrounded by documents, financial statements from the trust my grandmother had established, property details. For the Lake Montgomery mansion, preliminary auction guidelines that Jade had forwarded. The numbers were daunting but not impossible. With my grandmother's trust and the settlement I expected from the divorce, I could make a competitive bid without completely depleting my resources. It would be a stretch, a risk, but then, so was everything I'd done since Josh walked out. My phone buzzed with an email notification. Donnie Prescott with the subject line quarterly bonus structure. I opened it to find that the marketing strategy I'd developed was already showing results, and Donnie had decided to accelerate the bonus timeline in recognition of my contributions. The key amount wasn't life-changing, but the validation, the concrete acknowledgement of my professional value, sent a warm current of satisfaction through me. This was what I'd been missing for years, the simple affirmation of being recognized for my own merits, not as an extension of someone else. I gathered the papers into a neat stack, my decision crystallizing. Tomorrow I would meet with Howard to discuss the auction process in detail. I would explore this possibility thoroughly, approaching it not as an emotional reaction to Josh, but as a strategic investment in my future. Whether I ultimately bid on the house or not, the simple act of considering it, of recognizing that I had the capability, the resources, the right to pursue something so ambitious, felt like another step in reclaiming myself from the shadows of my marriage. As I prepared for bed, I caught sight of my reflection in the bathroom mirror, surrounded by the construction dust and exposed framework of the renovation. Like this space, I too was in transition, removing what no longer served me. uncovering original features that had been hidden away, creating something that reflected my true aesthetic rather than someone else's vision. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I looked forward to the unfinished state of things, to the process of becoming rather than the pressure of having arrived. The woman looking back at me from the mirror wasn't perfectly put together, wasn't the polished corporate wife I'd been for so long. She was authentic, emerging, real, and I liked her immensely. The conference room at Howard Bennett's law office overlooked Boston Harbor, the morning sun glinting off the water as sailboats navigated the gentle waves. I sat across from Howard, a distinguished man in his 60s with shrewd eyes and a reputation for handling the most complex real estate transactions in the city. "Ms. Parker," he began, closing the folder containing the documents I'd provided, "your financial position is stronger than I initially anticipated. The Lake Montgomery property is certainly within your reach, particularly given the reduced reserve price at auction." "But?" I prompted, sensing his hesitation. "But auctions are unpredictable. If multiple interested parties get involved in a bidding war, the price could escalate well beyond market value." He leaned back in his chair. "Including, I understand, your soon-to-be ex-husband's investment consortium." "That's correct," I confirmed. Howard studied me, curiosity evident in his expression. "May I ask why this particular property? Boston has no shortage of exceptional real estate opportunities." It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself repeatedly over the past week. Was I really considering spending millions on a property just to thwart Josh's plans? Was this about revenge, or was there something more substantive driving my interest? "It's complicated," I admitted. "Yes, there's a certain poetic justice in acquiring something my husband has coveted for years. But beyond that, the property itself is exceptional. Waterfront access in that area of Lake Montgomery is increasingly rare. The recent renovations have addressed the structural issues that plagued previous owners. And frankly, I've always loved that house. Josh may have been the one who talked about it constantly, but I was the one who appreciated its architectural integrity, its history, its potential." Howard nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. "Good, because while I appreciate the emotional satisfaction of outbidding your ex-husband, I wouldn't advise making a multi-million-dollar purchase solely for that purpose." "Understood," I said, appreciating his directness. "So what's our next step?" For the next hour, Howard walked me through the auction process in meticulous detail. The registration requirements, the financial pre-qualification, the bidding procedures, and the immediate payment expectations if I were to win. "I'd recommend conducting a full inspection before the auction," he advised as our meeting concluded. "Even though it's being sold as is, you should know exactly what you're getting into." As I left Howard's office, a strange calm had settled over me. I was about to commit to something that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Not just the financial scale of the potential purchase, but the audacity of it. The willingness to stand directly in opposition to Josh's desires, to assert my own ambitions without apology. Back at work, I found it difficult to focus on the marketing materials I was supposed to be reviewing. My mind kept returning to the Lake Montgomery mansion, to the bold step I was contemplating. Was I ready for such a declaration of independence? For the inevitable confrontation it would provoke? A knock at my office door interrupted my thoughts. Donnie stood in the doorway, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Got a minute?" he asked, closing the door behind him before I could respond. "Of course," I said, setting aside the marketing drafts. "What's up?" Donnie settled into the chair. Across from my desk, his usual easy confidence tempered by what looked like concern. "I just got off the phone with Tyler Maddox." The name triggered an immediate reaction. Tyler was one of Josh's closest business associates, a developer who frequently partnered with him on major projects. "And?" I prompted, trying to keep my expression neutral. "And he mentioned rather pointedly that your involvement with our Lakeview Heights project might constitute a conflict of interest." given your marriage to Josh. I felt a flicker of irritation. My pending divorce, you mean? That's what I told him, Donnie nodded. But I thought you should know they're watching, and apparently not pleased about your presence here. I see. I leaned back, processing this information. Is this going to be a problem for you? For the company? Donnie's laugh had an edge to it. Please. Tyler Maddox trying to throw his weight around doesn't concern me. I didn't hire you as a favor or to make a point. I hired you because you're the best person for the job. He paused, studying me. But I did want you to be aware that your ex is perhaps not taking your professional re-emergence as gracefully as he might. No, I agreed. That doesn't surprise me. There's something else, Donnie continued, a hint of reluctance in his voice. Tyler mentioned they're finalizing their consortium for the Lake Montgomery auction. Apparently, Josh has been telling potential investors it's practically a done deal. I felt a strange flutter in my chest, something between anxiety and anticipation. Is it? Not even close, Donnie shook his head. The property has garnered significant interest from multiple parties. It's going to be competitive. Including, potentially, from me. Though I hadn't shared those plans with Donnie or anyone else at the firm. The auction was still personal, still something I was exploring rather than fully committed to. Thanks for the heads up, I said, offering. A smile I hoped conveyed gratitude without revealing too much. After Donnie left, I sat at my desk, turning over this new information. Josh was moving ahead with his plans for the Lake Montgomery property, confident in his success, unaware of my interest. Meanwhile, he was already attempting to undermine my professional position, using his connections to suggest my employment constituted some sort of conflict. The pattern was so familiar, Josh creating a narrative that served his interests, expecting the world to align with his vision, leveraging his relationships to clear obstacles from his path, including, when necessary, me. But I wasn't an obstacle to be cleared anymore. I wasn't a supporting character in his story. I was writing my own narrative now, making my own choices, pursuing my own ambitions. That evening, I called Howard Bennett from my car. I'd like to proceed with the inspection of the Lake Montgomery property, I said, my decision crystallizing as I spoke the words. And I want to be fully prepared to bid at the auction. Understood, Howard replied, his tone professional but with a hint of approval. I'll make the arrangements immediately. The following Saturday, I stood in the empty grandeur of the Lake Montgomery mansion, sunlight streaming through the tall windows that overlooked the private dock and the shimmering water beyond. The house was even more impressive in person than in the photographs I'd studied. 5 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen, a library with built-in shelves from floor to ceiling, and multiple terraces designed for entertaining. Howard. And the inspector moved methodically from room to room, noting details in their reports. But I found myself drawn to the water. Standing on the main terrace, watching boats glide across the lake, I could understand why Josh had fixated on this property for so long. It represented arrival, achievement, success visible to all. But for me, it represented something different. Not external validation, but internal conviction. The courage to want something for myself, to pursue it directly rather than through the reflected glory of someone else's achievements. Ms. Parker? Howard approached, clipboard in hand. The inspection is complete. There are some minor issues, expected in a property of this age, but nothing structural or significant. The previous owner's renovations were quite thorough. I nodded, still gazing at the water. And the auction? Any update on expected participants? At least 4 serious contenders that we know of, including your husband's consortium. Howard hesitated. Are you certain you want to proceed? Once we register your intent to bid, it becomes public information. Mr. Walker will know. The question hung in the air between us. Was I ready for that confrontation? For Josh to know that I was directly challenging his plans? for the inevitable accusations of spite, of emotional decision-making, of trying to punish him? In that moment, standing on the terrace of a house that perfectly embodied both Josh's ambitions and my own emerging sense of possibility, something shifted inside me. This wasn't about Josh anymore. It wasn't about proving something to him or getting back at him for his betrayal. This was about me. About declaring, in the most tangible way possible, that I was no longer defined by my relationship to him. That I could want things, pursue things, achieve things entirely on my own terms. Yes, I said firmly, turning to face Howard. I'm certain. Register me for the auction. As we walked through the house one final time before leaving, I allowed myself to imagine living there. Not as Josh Walker's wife, hosting his business associates and supporting his image, but as Alicia Parker, creating a space that reflected my own tastes, my own priorities, my own vision for the future. The mental image was startlingly clear, vivid in a way that surprised me. Morning coffee on the terrace, evenings reading in the library, dinner parties with friends who valued me for myself rather than my connection to Josh. It felt right. It felt possible. It felt like mine. The auction is in 3 weeks, Howard reminded me as we drove away from the property. Are you prepared for what happens if you win? And equally, for what happens if you don't? I watched the mansion recede. In the side mirror, the afternoon sun casting it in golden light. Yes, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. Either way, I'm ready. Because this moment, this decision to pursue something solely because I wanted it, regardless of how it affected Josh or what others might think, was already a victory. Win or lose the house, I had crossed a threshold in my own mind, reached a point of no return in reclaiming my independence. For the first time since Josh had walked out, I felt genuinely, profoundly grateful that he had. Without that painful ending, I might never have found my way back to myself, to the woman who had been waiting patiently beneath years of compromise and accommodation, ready to emerge when finally given permission. I had given myself that permission now. And whatever happened next, I wouldn't be taking it back. The call came at 9:37 a.m. on Monday, exactly 4 days after I'd registered as a bidder for the Lake Montgomery property. I was in the middle of a presentation to our marketing team when my phone lit up with Josh's name. I declined the call and continued outlining our strategy for the upcoming quarter. 3 minutes later, it rang again. And again. By the 4th call, I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. What is it, Josh? I'm in a meeting. Is it true? His voice was tight, controlled, but with an undercurrent of disbelief that almost made me smile. Are you seriously bidding on the Lake Montgomery property? So he knew. Part of me had been anticipating this moment. The confrontation, the inevitable accusations, the attempt to make me question my own judgment. Yet I felt remarkably calm, almost detached, as if observing the situation from a distance rather than standing at its center. Yes, I replied simply. I am. A pause then. Why? What possible reason could you have for interfering in this? You know how long I've been working toward acquiring that property. I'm not interfering in anything, Josh. I'm participating in an open auction for a property I'm interested in purchasing. A property you never expressed any interest in until now, he countered, anger replacing the initial shock in his voice. This is about punishing me, isn't it? Some twisted form of revenge? The accusation was so predictable it almost made me laugh. Of course, he would frame my independent action as being fundamentally about him, as if I couldn't possibly have motives, desires or ambitions that didn't revolve around our relationship. Believe it or not, Josh, not everything I do is about you, I said evenly. The Lake Montgomery property is an excellent investment. It has architectural significance, prime waterfront location, and recent renovations that have addressed the structural issues It's exactly the kind of property I'd want to own. Since when do you know anything about property investment? The dismissal in his tone was so automatic, so ingrained, he probably didn't even recognize it. Since I spent 15 years married to one of Boston's top real estate developers, I replied. I was paying attention, even if you didn't notice. Another pause. Longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted to the reasonable, slightly patronizing tone he used when trying to manage what he perceived as emotional reactions from others. Alicia, be realistic. You can't possibly compete with the consortium I've assembled. We're prepared to go significantly above asking. You'll only end up embarrassing yourself and wasting money on the registration fees. Thank you for your concern, I said, matching his tone precisely. But I'm comfortable with my decision and my financial position. Financial position? He made a sound between a laugh and a scoff. The divorce isn't even finalized. What financial position are you talking about? The one you never bothered to ask about, I replied, then checked my watch. I need to get back to my meeting. We can discuss this through our lawyers if necessary. This isn't over, he warned, the reasonable facade cracking slightly. You're making a mistake. Possibly, I conceded, but it's my mistake to make. Goodbye, Josh. I ended the call and took a deep breath, steadying myself before returning to the conference room. To my surprise, I found I was smiling, not from spite or satisfaction at Josh's discomfort, but from a deeper, more genuine place. For perhaps the first time in our entire relationship, I had made a major decision without seeking his approval or considering how it would affect him. I had acted purely from my own desire, my own judgment, my own sense of what was right for me, and it felt incredible. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of productivity. I finalized the quarterly marketing strategy, met with the design team about upcoming promotional materials, and scheduled a site visit to our newest development. By the time I left the office, the confrontation with Josh felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the satisfaction of work well done. That evening, I met with Howard Bennett to review the final preparations for the auction, which was now just 2 weeks away. Your ex-husband knows you're bidding, Howard observed as we went through the paperwork. It wasn't a question. He called this morning, I confirmed. He wasn't pleased. I imagine not. Howard's expression remained neutral, but a hint of amusement flickered in his eyes. His attorney contacted me today, suggesting we reconsider your participation due to potential complications with the divorce settlement. I felt a flare of irritation. What complications? None that actually exist, Howard assured me. It was a transparent attempt to intimidate. I informed him that your decision to bid on the property has no bearing on the ongoing divorce proceedings, and that any attempt to suggest otherwise could be construed as interference with a lawful business transaction. Thank you, I said, genuinely. Grateful for his steady presence in this increasingly complex situation. It's my job, he replied simply. Now, let's discuss bidding strategy. Based on recent comparable sales and the particular circumstances of this auction, I'd recommend setting an absolute ceiling of... He named a figure that made my breath catch slightly, though I'd seen the numbers before in our previous discussions. We spent the next hour mapping out various scenarios, discussing incremental bidding strategies, and preparing for the emotional pressure of the auction environment itself. The key, Howard emphasized, is to remain detached. Set your limits beforehand and stick to them, regardless of who else is bidding or how high they go. This is a business decision, not an emotional one. I nodded, though we both knew the reality was more nuanced. Yes, the Lake Montgomery property was objectively a sound investment. Yes, I was approaching the auction with careful financial planning and clear limits. But there was an undeniably emotional component to my decision. Not spite toward Josh, as he had immediately assumed, but something more profound. The reclamation of my right to want things, to pursue things, to compete openly rather than supporting. From the sidelines, As I drove home that night, the city lights reflecting off the harbor waters, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and serenity. The auction was still 2 weeks away, the outcome uncertain, yet I already felt transformed by the simple act of declaring my intention, of saying, "This is what I want, and I deserve to pursue it as much as anyone else." At home, I checked my email to find a message from Jade with the subject line, "Your ex is losing it." The body contained a single line, "Call me when you can. The gossip is too good not to share." I smiled, pouring myself a glass of wine before dialing her number. Jade answered on the first ring, her voice bubbling with barely contained glee. "Oh my God, Alicia, you've created absolute chaos in Boston's real estate circles. Josh has been calling everyone, trying to figure out how you could possibly afford to bid on Lake Montgomery." "And?" I prompted, settling onto my newly reupholstered sofa, another change I'd made to reclaim the space as my own. "And no one knows," which is driving him crazy. Jade's satisfaction was palpable even through the phone. "He keeps telling people you're acting out of spite, trying to sabotage his deal, but honestly, I think he's terrified you might actually outbid him." "That would be quite something," I admitted, sipping my wine. "It would be legendary," Jade corrected. "But even if you don't win, the fact that you're making him sweat, making him explain to his investors why his ex-wife is suddenly a competitor, that's already a victory." She was right, though not in the way she meant. The victory wasn't in making Josh uncomfortable or disrupting his plans. It was in the freedom I now felt to act without considering his reaction, to pursue my own interests without apology or explanation. After we hung up, I wandered through my house, the house that had once been ours but was gradually becoming mine alone. The renovated bathroom was nearly complete, the updated kitchen was underway, and I'd converted Josh's home office into a reading room with the comfortable chairs he'd always deemed too casual for our aesthetic. Each change, small or large, was an affirmation of my emerging independence. Each decision made without reference to his preferences or opinions was another step toward reclaiming my sense of self. Whether I won the Lake Montgomery property or not, I had already gained something far more valuable: the courage to live on my own terms, to trust my own judgment, to pursue what I wanted without diminishing myself to accommodate someone else's ego. It was, I realized as I stood in the quiet of my transformed home, my first real taste of freedom in 15 years. And it was intoxicating. As the auction date approached, I found myself busier than I'd been in years. My role at Prescott Development had expanded beyond the initial marketing position. Donnie had invited me to join the executive strategy team, recognizing that my years in Boston's real estate adjacent circles had given me insights into market trends and community dynamics that more traditional executives sometimes missed. "You see things differently," he'd explained when offering me the promotion. "You understand both the numbers and the narratives that drive decisions in this market." The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, Josh had dismissed my observations about property trends or market shifts as uninformed opinions, gentle, patronizing corrections following whenever I'd venture a thought at dinner parties. Now, those same insights were being valued, respected, sought after in professional settings. 1 week before the auction, I sat in my office reviewing property assessments when my assistant announced an unexpected visitor. "Ms. Parker, there's a Courtney Winters here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's quite insistent." I froze momentarily, the name instantly registering. Courtney. Josh's executive assistant. The woman he'd left me for after 15 years of marriage. "Send her in," I heard myself say, curiosity overriding my initial instinct to refuse the meeting. Courtney was exactly as I remembered from company functions: tall, slender, impeccably dressed in a way that suggested careful study of what successful women in Boston's business circles wore. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her makeup flawless, her expression a careful mask of professional neutrality. Ms. Parker, she began, standing awkwardly just inside my office door. Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. Alicia. Please, I replied, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. What can I do for you, Courtney? She sat, her posture rigid, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Up close, I could see the strain beneath her polished exterior, slight shadows under her eyes, a tension in her jaw that makeup couldn't disguise. This is uncomfortable, she began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider her approach. I'm here, about the Lake Montgomery property. Of course she was. I kept my expression neutral, waiting for her to continue. Josh doesn't know I'm here, she added quickly. He would be furious if he found out, but I needed to speak with you directly. About? I prompted when she hesitated again. Courtney took a deep breath, her composure slipping slightly. I need to ask you to withdraw your bid. Despite everything, I almost laughed. Not from amusement, but from the sheer audacity of the request. This woman who had participated in the dismantling of my marriage was now sitting in my office asking me to step aside for Josh's benefit. That's quite a request, I said evenly. May I ask why? Because it's important to him, she replied, as if this should be self-evident. This property, it's not just an investment, it's... She paused, searching for words. It represents something to Josh, a milestone. I'm aware, I said, remembering all the times Josh had spoken about the Lake Montgomery property over the years, how owning it would cement his status among Boston's elite developers. But I'm afraid I don't see why that should influence my decision to bid. Courtney leaned forward slightly, her carefully maintained facade cracking further. Look, I know this is awkward given our situation, but Josh has been working toward this acquisition for years. His investors are counting on it. His reputation is tied to it. I studied her, seeing beyond the polished exterior to the anxiety beneath. Courtney, why are you really here? This can't simply be about a property auction. She hesitated, then seemed to deflate slightly, her shoulders dropping. Things have been difficult lately. Josh is under a lot of pressure. The divorce, the consortium investors, now your unexpected bid. He's not handling it well. Not handling it well how? I asked, a knot forming in my stomach despite my best efforts to remain detached. He's angry all the time. Distant. Critical. Her voice lowered, as if admitting a shameful secret. Nothing I do is right anymore. I can't seem to anticipate his needs the way he expects. The irony of her words struck me with physical force. She was describing exactly the dynamic that had slowly poisoned my marriage to Josh. His gradual withdrawal when faced with challenges, his tendency to become critical and cold when his expectations weren't met, the impossible task of anticipating needs he hadn't articulated. And you think if he gets the Lake Montgomery property, things will improve? I asked gently, finding myself in the surreal position of feeling something close to compassion for the woman who had replaced me. I thought... She looked down at her clasped hands. I thought if I could help make this happen for him, show him that I'm on his side, that I understand what matters to him. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. I recognized the thinking pattern, the desperate attempt to earn approval by solving problems, by sacrificing your own interests to smooth his path. It was exactly the trap I'd fallen into year after year in my marriage. Courtney, I said carefully, I understand what you're trying to do, but based on my experience, appeasing Josh when he's in this state doesn't actually solve the underlying issue. Her eyes snapped up to meet mine, surprise evident in her expression, perhaps at my insight, perhaps at my willingness to engage with her as a person rather than simply as the other woman. What do you mean? She asked. I mean that Josh's happiness can't be your responsibility. No property, no business success, no amount of anticipating his needs will fix what's broken in him. I spoke from years of painful experience, from countless attempts to solve problems I hadn't created, to fill voids I couldn't possibly fill. Courtney was quiet for a long moment, absorbing my words. "You're not going to withdraw your bid," she said finally, a statement rather than a question. "No," I confirmed gently. "I'm not. This auction is important to me too, but for very different reasons." She nodded slowly, gathering her composure as she rose to leave. At the door, she paused, turning back to face me. "He said you were bitter," she admitted. "That you couldn't accept that he'd moved on. That you were trying to punish him with this bid." "What do you think?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perception. She studied me for a moment, her gaze more perceptive than I'd given her credit for. "I think you're exactly what he's afraid of. A woman who doesn't need his approval anymore." With that remarkably insightful observation, she left, the click of her heels fading down the hallway. I sat motionless at my desk, processing the unexpected encounter. The conversation had left me feeling strangely weightless, as if I'd set down a burden I hadn't realized I was still carrying. For so long, I had defined myself in relation to Josh, first as his supportive wife, then as his betrayed ex. But in speaking to Courtney, in recognizing the pattern she was falling into that I had finally escaped, I felt myself fully stepping into a new identity. Not Josh Walker's ex-wife, but simply Alicia Parker, a woman building a life on her own. Terms. That evening, I met with Howard for our final strategy session before the auction. We reviewed the financial details, confirmed the maximum bid I was comfortable making, and discussed the practical logistics of the day itself. "You seem different," Howard observed as we concluded our meeting. "More settled." "I am," I acknowledged, surprised by how true it felt. For a while, I think part of me was still seeing this auction as a response to Josh, a way of proving something, to him or perhaps to myself. But I've realized it's simpler than that. I want this property. I can afford this property. I have every right to bid on this property. The rest is just noise. Howard smiled, a genuine expression that creased the corners of his eyes. That's exactly the mindset you need. Clear objectives, personal conviction, emotional detachment from the outcome. As I drove home that night, I thought about how much had changed in the relatively short time since Josh had walked out. I had reclaimed my professional identity, rediscovered passions and interests I'd set aside for years, begun reshaping my home to reflect my own aesthetic, rather than our carefully curated image. Most importantly, I had started building something new, not just a career or a potentially new home, but a sense of self that existed independent of my relationship status. A foundation solid enough to support whatever came next, whether I won the auction or not. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt genuinely excited about my future. Not because it was linked to someone else's vision or plans, but because it was entirely, wonderfully my own. The morning of the auction dawned clear, and bright sunlight glinting off Boston Harbor as I stood at my kitchen window, coffee in hand, trying to calm the nervous energy coursing through me. In just a few hours, I would either own the Lake Montgomery property or walk away empty-handed. Both possibilities carried their own emotional weight, their own implications for my newly reconstructed identity. My phone buzzed with a text from Jade. "Ready for battle?" I smiled, typing back, "As ready as I'll ever be." My doorbell rang at precisely 9 a.m., Howard, punctual as always, dressed in a crisp suit that conveyed both authority and understated elegance. "How are you feeling?" he asked as we walked to his car. "Surprisingly calm," I replied, realizing it was true. The nervous energy remained, but beneath it lay a steady certainty. I knew exactly why I was doing this, exactly what my limits were, exactly who I was in this moment. Whatever happened today, that knowledge wouldn't change. The auction was being held at the Suffolk County Courthouse. a grand building whose imposing facade seemed fitting for the drama about to unfold inside. Howard and I arrived early, checking in with the auction officials and receiving our bidding paddle, number 17, a detail that struck me as auspicious, though I couldn't have explained why. We took seats near the back of the room, allowing us to observe other participants as they arrived. Howard pointed out key players discreetly: a developer from New York, a representative from a hotel chain rumored to be interested in converting the property, a wealthy family known for collecting architectural landmarks, and there, Howard murmured, nodding toward the entrance, is your competition. Josh walked in, flanked by Tyler Maddox and two other men I recognized as members of his investment consortium. He was immaculately dressed in his power suit, the one he reserved for major negotiations and closings, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, custom-tailored to emphasize his athletic build. The Josh Walker uniform for conquest. He scanned the room, his gaze eventually finding mine. For a brief moment, our eyes locked across the crowded space. I saw surprise flicker across his face. Perhaps he had convinced himself I wouldn't actually show up, that my registration had been merely a bluff designed to unsettle him. Then his expression hardened, jaw tightening in the way it did when he was preparing for confrontation. I simply nodded once, a neutral acknowledgement, before turning my attention back to Howard and the auction materials. From the corner of my eye, I saw Josh conferring with his associates, gesturing in my direction. Let them speculate, I thought. Let them wonder. My presence here wasn't about them. At precisely 10 a.m., the auctioneer called the room to order. He was a compact man with a resonant voice that belied his stature, commanding attention as he explained the process, the property details, and the opening bid requirements. The Lake Montgomery estate represents a rare opportunity to acquire one of the area's most distinguished waterfront properties, he began, his practiced cadence establishing the rhythm that would carry us through the proceedings. We'll start the bidding at $3 million. Do I have an opening bid? A paddle raised immediately near the front, the New York developer, establishing his interest early. $3 million, the auctioneer acknowledged. Do I have 3.2? Another, paddle raised, the hotel chain representative. Then another, and another. The early bidding moved quickly, escalating by predictable increments as participants established their presence. Josh's consortium entered at $4 million, Tyler Maddox raising their paddle with casual confidence. I remained still, following Howard's advice to wait until the initial flurry subsided. By $4.5 million, 2 participants had dropped out. By $5 million, only 3 serious contenders remained: Josh's consortium, the hotel chain, and a bidder I couldn't identify. From my position, $5.2 million, the auctioneer called. Do I have 5.4? Howard glanced at me, a question in his eyes. I nodded once, and he raised our paddle for the first time. $5.4 million from paddle number 17. They die? Auctioneer announced. I felt rather than saw Josh's reaction, a sudden tension that seemed to radiate across the room. I kept my eyes forward, focused on the auctioneer rather than looking in Josh's direction. The bidding continued, now in a more measured pace as the numbers climbed. The hotel chain dropped out at $6 million. The unknown bidder held on until 6.8 before shaking their head at the auctioneer's query for 7. And then there were 2, Josh's consortium and me. 6.8 million, the auctioneer confirmed. Do I have 7? Howard raised our paddle again, calm and deliberate. 7 million from paddle 17. Do I have 7.2? Tyler. Maddox conferred briefly with Josh before raising their paddle. 7.2 from paddle 8, so it continued, the increments feeling increasingly weighty as we approached my predetermined limit. Howard maintained his composure, raising our paddle at each appropriate moment, but I could feel him growing more tense beside me as the numbers climbed. 8.4 from paddle 8, the auctioneer called. Do I have 8.6? My limit was 9 million, a figure Howard and I had arrived at after careful analysis of the property's value, the market conditions, and my financial position. We were approaching that threshold faster than I had anticipated. 8.6, Howard confirmed, raising our paddle once more. I risked a glance in Josh's direction and found him already staring at me, his expression a mixture of disbelief and growing concern. This wasn't playing out as he had expected. I wasn't supposed to be able to compete at this level, wasn't supposed to have the resources or the resolve to challenge him directly. 8.8 from Paddle 8, the auctioneer announced after Josh's consortium raised again. Howard looked at me, the question clear in his eyes. We were one increment away from my stated limit. I nodded, my decision firm. 9 million, Howard called, raising our paddle. A murmur ran through the room. This was significantly above the property's assessed value, moving into territory that surprised even the experienced real estate professionals present. Josh and Tyler Maddox were engaged in intense conversation, heads bent together, expressions serious. I waited, heart pounding but externally calm as they deliberated. Finally, Tyler looked up and shook his head at the auctioneer. 9 million from Paddle 17, the auctioneer called. Going once. I held my breath. Going twice. Josh was staring at me now, something unreadable in his expression. Sold to Paddle 17 for $9 million. The gavel fell with a crack that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. A moment of stunned silence, then the room erupted. In conversation, people turning to each other to discuss the unexpected outcome. Howard turned to me, extending his hand with a rare, broad smile. Congratulations, Ms. Parker. You've just purchased the Lake Montgomery estate. I accepted his handshake, a strange calmness settling over me despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. Thank you, Howard, for everything. As we stood to begin the paperwork process, I finally allowed myself to look directly at Josh. He was still seated, Tyler Maddox speaking animatedly beside him, but his attention was fixed entirely on me. In his expression, I saw the one thing I had never witnessed. In 15 years of marriage, genuine shock. I had done the impossible. I had outbid the man who had always seen me as an extension of himself, rather than a person with my own capabilities, my own resources, my own power. I had won. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Purchasing the Lake Montgomery estate wasn't simply a matter of winning the auction. It entailed mountains of paperwork, financial transfers, insurance policies, and property assessments. Howard guided me through each step with practiced efficiency, while I focused on balancing these new responsibilities with my growing role at Prescott Development. News of the auction's outcome spread quickly through Boston's business circles. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from old acquaintances, former friends from my life with Josh, and industry connections, some offering congratulations, others fishing for details about how I'd managed to outbid one of the city's most established developers. I responded selectively, maintaining a dignified silence about the specifics of my financial situation. Let them wonder. Let them speculate. The truth, that I had resources of my own that Josh had never bothered to inquire about, wasn't anyone's business but mine. 3 weeks after the auction, I stood on the private dock of what was now officially my property, watching the sunset cast golden light across the lake. The enormity of what I'd accomplished was still sinking in, not just the acquisition itself, but what it represented. 6 months ago, I had been a woman adrift, my identity so thoroughly entangled with my husband's that his departure had left me questioning my very existence. Now I stood on the grounds of one of Boston's most coveted properties, purchased with my own money, chosen by my own judgment, representing my own achievement. My phone rang. Donnie Prescott. "Have you seen the business journal yet?" he asked without preamble when I answered. "No, why?" "Page 3. There's a profile on you, the reinvention of Alicia Parker. Quite flattering, actually. They're calling you Boston's emerging property maverick, and highlighting your work on our Lakeview Heights campaign." I laughed, surprised, and slightly embarrassed by the attention. "That seems excessive." "Not at all," Donnie countered. "The marketing strategy you developed has generated more pre-sales than any previous development in our portfolio." The Lake Montgomery purchase just added an interesting personal dimension that journalists couldn't resist. After we hung up, I found the article online, scanning it with a mixture of amusement and pride. The writer had positioned my story as one of professional renaissance, a marketing executive who had stepped away from her career for family reasons, only to return with renewed purpose and unexpected impact. My purchase of the Lake Montgomery estate was framed as both a savvy investment and a bold statement of independence. What the article didn't mention, likely because no one but Jade and I knew the full story, was the sweet satisfaction of acquiring the property that Josh had coveted for so long. That wasn't information I'd shared with the reporter, not because I was ashamed of it, but because it no longer felt like the most important part of the narrative. The most important part was that I had remembered who I was, that I had reclaimed not just financial independence, but the confidence to trust my own judgment, to pursue my own desires, to live according to my own values rather than someone else's expectations. As I walked the grounds of my new home, planning, renovations, and envisioning the life I would build there, I realized I had crossed a threshold. The pain of Josh's betrayal, the humiliation of being replaced, the uncertainty about my future. These feelings hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had receded, overshadowed by something more powerful, a genuine excitement about the life I was creating, not in reaction to what had been taken from me, but in celebration of what I had found within myself. I was overseeing the installation of new windows in the Lake Montgomery estate when my security system alerted me to a visitor at the gate. The camera feed showed Josh's Audi idling at the entrance, his expression obscured by distance, but his posture tense even through the grainy footage. After a moment's hesitation, I pressed the intercom. "Josh, can we talk?" His voice came through, slightly distorted but unmistakably strained. I buzzed the gate open, watching as his car wound up the long driveway to where I stood on the front steps. He emerged looking uncharacteristically disheveled, his usually perfect hair slightly mussed, his expression haggard. "Nice place," he said as he approached, attempting his usual sardonic tone but falling short. "I think so," I replied simply. He glanced at the workers carrying materials through the front door. "Making changes already?" "It's what one does with a new property." The awkward small talk hung between us until finally he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The consortium investors are furious. Some have pulled out of other projects. My reputation has taken a hit." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, genuinely meaning it despite everything. I took no joy in his professional struggles, only in my own triumphs. "How did you do it, Alicia?" he asked finally, the question that had clearly been eating at him. "Where did you get that kind of money?" "My grandmother's trust," I said simply. "The one you dismissed as insignificant years ago." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something that looked remarkably like respect. "I underestimated you." "Yes," I agreed. "You did, for 15 years. He nodded slowly, accepting this truth perhaps for the first time. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." I studied him, this man who had once been the center of my universe, and felt nothing but a gentle release. "I know. And that's enough." Divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning, a surprisingly anticlimactic end to 15 years of marriage. I signed the papers in Howard's office, the terms far more equitable than Josh's initial proposal had been, a reflection of both my lawyer's skill and Josh's changed perspective following our confrontation at the Lake Montgomery estate. That evening, I hosted my first dinner party in my new home. The guests weren't Josh's business associates or the carefully cultivated social connections of my former life. but people I had chosen, Jade, Donnie, and his wife, colleagues from Prescott, development who had become friends, neighbors I'd met since moving in. As we gathered around the dining table, not the austere modern piece Josh had insisted upon in our previous home, but a warm cherrywood table I'd found at an antique shop, I looked at the faces around me and felt a profound sense of rightness. These relationships weren't strategically cultivated to advance someone else's career or maintain a certain social image. They were genuine connections based on mutual respect and shared interests. "A toast," Jade declared, raising her glass. "To Alicia, who reminded all of us that it's never too late to reclaim your power." Glasses clinked as murmurs of agreement circled the table. I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine and everything to do with finally being seen for who I truly was. Later, as the last guests departed, I stood on the terrace overlooking the moonlit lake. My phone buzzed with a text from Josh. "Heard the divorce was finalized today. Wishing you well, sincerely." I considered responding, then simply set the phone aside. Our chapter was closed. Whatever validation or closure he sought wasn't mine to provide anymore. Instead, I turned my attention to the shimmering water, to the life I was building, to the future that stretched before me, limitless, unscripted, gloriously my own. 1 year after purchasing the Lake Montgomery estate, I stood in the newly renovated guest house on the property, watching as a young woman carefully unpacked her laptop and portfolio. Genevieve, my first mentee in what had become the Parker Foundation for Women in Business, an initiative I'd started using a portion of my grandmother's trust to support women re-entering the workforce after career interruptions. "I can't thank you enough for this opportunity," she said, arranging her materials on the desk I'd selected specifically for this purpose. "6 months ago, I thought my career was over after taking 5 years off to raise my kids." "Your career isn't defined by interruptions," I told her, remembering my own journey back to professional identity. "It's defined by your talents, your persistence, and sometimes the people who believe in you when you've forgotten how to believe in yourself." The foundation had started small, just one guest house, one stipend, one mentoring relationship. But it was growing, attracting attention and additional funding from companies recognizing the untapped potential of women who had stepped away from their careers and were struggling to return. That evening, I received an unexpected email from Courtney, the first contact since our meeting in my office more than a year earlier. She had left Josh, returned to school, and was applying for the Foundation's next mentorship cycle. "You were right," she wrote. "His happiness wasn't my responsibility. I'm finally figuring out what actually makes me happy." As I sat on my terrace, watching the sunset reflect on the lake, I thought about the strange, painful journey that had led me here. From the devastation of Josh's betrayal to the triumph of outbidding him for this very property, and finally to the quiet satisfaction of creating something meaningful from that experience. The house that had once represented Josh's ultimate status symbol had become something far more valuable, a place of reinvention, of second chances, of women reclaiming their power, one story at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.